The New York Times has a new piece which has left liberals across the internet triggered and outraged. In one of those cases where you actually can judge the article by its title, liberals, you're not as smart as you think, by professor of political science at the University of Virginia, Gerald Alexander, is causing a major debate. Now the debates normally take the position of outraged liberals sharing into their Facebook, looking for help and solace in understanding how anybody could say something so terrible. In other cases, it's conservatives sharing proudly and blatantly, "Ha! Somebody finally said it." While their liberal friends will show up and say that this is just more mean talk from the right. However, Mr. Alexander brings up a lot of good points that are worth considering. Some of his prominent points deal with the fact that because the left and liberals have major control over prominent institutions dealing with the American culture, that's caused them to lose touch with the American people, and that they're actively making more mistakes that's driving the country farther away from them. Now by this, he mentions not only the media, but also universities, which I've touched on before as well. Alexander begins his piece by talking about how people often vote against things as much as they vote for them, and that many liberals know this, which is part of why they go to such extremes to paint conservatives, to paint Trump voters, to paint anyone on the right side of politics as something completely without goodness. But as one can imagine, this mentality has its drawbacks. Given the undeniable loathing that many in the media have directed towards the president, and by extension, the poor Trump voters too stupid or racist not to vote for him, people are shifting away from listening to liberal celebrities, liberal media, liberal professors, and noting the extreme personal bias they have against all of these individuals. He cites the recent White House Correspondents' Dinner, which has become predictable to most Americans in that they know it's a time where we're going to see unmitigated Trump bashing. For many, the event is nothing more than a pretentious, self-righteous media congratulating itself as it does nothing but trying to burn the presidency down. Whether that's true or not, perception is reality. The American people, both liberal and conservative, are beginning to see people like Michelle Wolf as the personification of the one-sided toxicity of the American media. He also notes that progressives dominate not only the news media industry, but also entertainment and the universities as well. Mr. Alexander goes on to point out that when your view dominates entertainment, news, and the education industries, all three of which have shown evidence of trying to filter out and blacklist conservatives from working with them, then high-ranking people in these industries, such as celebrities or professors, start to view themselves not as conveyors of information or even entertainment, but as ambassadors of righteousness. Now, that's my term, not Alexander's, but Alexander does say that when this evolution happens, they start to view themselves as far more powerful than they actually are. They speak on subjects which they have no expertise on, but are simply communicating popular views. Since, however, the entire culture agrees with them, they've never faced critical viewpoints or any opposing views whatsoever on things that they take as patent fact. In so doing, they have no sensitivity whatsoever to when they say things that are patently false or extremely inflammatory to huge swaths of the population. In some cases, their bubbles are so thick that whenever massive amounts of people are deeply troubled by the statements they're making, statements which may not be true in the slightest but are deeply demeaning towards a lot of people, they simply dismiss this as bigots who are mad that someone finally called them out. They become completely blind or dismissive to the outrage their one-sided views create among many, many people. So whenever things like Donald Trump happen, they're completely blindsided by the fact. And this becomes even more apparent when someone from their side crosses a line. By this, I'm referring to the recent Kanye scandal, where a black celebrity would ever disagree with all the other celebrities. By seeing the treatment that he's received, it comes off less as a sophisticated world of celebrities and professors trying to educate the rest of the world, as so much as a very tyrannical and domineering culture, angry and fighting back against anyone who would ever disagree with them. Put all this together, and liberals as a culture are becoming very good at creating little more than resentment. Alexander reaches the point of his article where he cites numerous instances where liberals became outraged at what to the rest of the world appeared to be a non-event because they specifically failed to communicate what, if anything, was wrong with it, but were fine with demeaning millions of people because they were bigots. This, he goes on to say, became much worse during the Obama years, where liberals became more convinced that conservatives were their intellectual and moral inferiors. And during this time, liberals actually became, in so doing, intolerant to different views. This went all the way up to the president himself, who famously said during the 2008 campaign that Rust Belt voters would get bitter, they cling to their guns or religion or antipathy of people who aren't like them. Given the nature of this article, that last part rings startlingly ironic. Alexander also calls for liberals to try not to act so certain that racism, prejudice, and bigotry are the only motivators for why someone would disagree with them and why the world isn't perfectly equal. Self-righteousness, he says, can get things wrong. He closes the piece by warning liberals that they're currently in a self-reinforcing cycle. He says in his closing paragraphs, "When they use their positions in American culture to lecture, judge, and disdain, they push more people into an opposing coalition that liberals are increasingly prone to think of as deplorable. That only validates their own worst prejudices about the other America." I'll say this on the piece. I'm glad somebody finally said it. Or at the very least, I'm glad somebody at the New York Times finally said this. Now, granted, this is in the opinion section, but I'm happy that the New York Times said it. They are a magazine that I've been highly critical of because they've done very little to try to reach out to conservatives following what was a disastrous lead-up to the 2016 election. They actually came out saying, we did a horrible job over the last decade of holding the president and holding liberals accountable for anything. And they were actually a huge part of the problem. Now, since then, they haven't really done that much better. But this is an interesting article, I think, because it's very critical of liberal mentalities and speaks to a lot of the concerns, a lot of the outrage from the rest of America, as well as helping many on the left understand why so many of the people who used to support them have disappeared. Like that's something that I'm seeing that a lot of people aren't really aware of, is how many are abandoning the left from seeing really how they act, or like seeing how they treat conservatives, or even seeing how they treat each other. I've got one friend who he's been a liberal for years, but he's now very bothered by the fact that he can't have polite conversations with other liberals, and that the only people who are actually nice to him in conversations are conservatives who we all understand don't agree with any of his policies. But he knows that we're the only people who will treat him with respect while we can disagree with him. This is something that many on the left are just simply not aware. This is happening to them. They're being abandoned by their own behaviors. Part of me was wondering why the New York Times would even publish this, being that the liberal audiences is specifically their target market. They've officially abandoned conservatives. They've abandoned, red America, and this is who they're targeting. So this article I found very surprising. But what I think is happening is that the New York Times, if they're still trying to be biased, which they very may well be, this is a warning. This is a warning where they're trying to say, look, we're going to lose again if this behavior doesn't stop. And if that's the case, keep doing what you're doing. But what I found the most interesting was that whenever this article started showing up in my Facebook feed, I follow a lot of different people. Many liberals are in my circle of influence, And whenever I saw this article start coming up, it was with it was with the same sense of dismissal and sometimes outrage that the article actually outlined. So I'm wondering how much of an impact this is actually going to have on the people it's directed to actually read it. Something that I'm wondering is if a lot of the people who have been silently abandoning the left are just silently reading this article, and yeah, it makes sense. While the people who outright are willing to have a conversation openly don't realize that the way that they talk about this article is proving the article true.